Hello, welcome everybody. If those in the back, if you don't mind moving forward just to join our conversation today, just move up, make yourself at home. Excellent. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So welcome to this session. Has the Scale-Up and Growth Accelerator program made a difference? Is it making a difference? So today we're going to have welcome and introductions. Rhys and Jonathan will introduce themselves. My name is Catherine Graham and I'm the Executive Director of the Impact Action Lab at Alberta Innovates. And you ask, what does the Impact Action Lab do? So what we do is we work with researchers and entrepreneurs to really help them amplify and activate both the economic and societal impact of their research and innovation efforts. So great opportunity to work coalface in both strategy and implementation. I'm going to go over a performance impact management system, a process, conceptually, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rhys John, and she's going to go through it using the Scale-Up Gap program as an example of that. And then we're going to hand it over to Jonathan, and Jonathan is going to talk about a realist impact assessment approach, which is quite a novel approach to assessing impact. So what is the problem we're trying to solve? So both in Alberta, Canada, and internationally, there's a scale-up gap for companies. So we have a lot of startup companies, but we're really wanting to see how we can support those companies to scale and grow. So as part of this identification of the problem, that helped us focus in terms of what instruments, what policy, what kind of program could we do to help address that scale-up gap. And we looked to Jonathan here, given his background in policy, both from the UK and internationally, to do a review of different policy instruments and funding instruments, and particularly those demand-side instruments, to say what are the best instruments to address this. And accelerators, an accelerator program, was really identified as one of the key instruments or interventions for addressing this. So this is very much an ecosystem approach. In Alberta's ecosystem, this could be any ecosystem across the world. And what we wanted was a navigational tool or a communication tool to really communicate with our communities and our companies to say, this is the focus of the program. So we used the Startup Commons approach, which kind of maps our company stage of development. We adapted it, and then we communicated that we're very much focused on the valley of death in terms of validating and scaling. So very much a useful tool in terms of that. And then we also were very clear on what our focus was in terms of the companies, the number of staff that we were wanting to focus on. So I tend to work with a lot of research networks, innovation networks, entrepreneurial networks, and when they come to me in terms of what their ideas are and their gaps, it often is very much at an ecosystem level, lots of complexity in terms of partnerships, jurisdictions, and usually everyone wants to affect transformative change. So when they come to me and ask for an assessment or design an assessment in terms of the strategy and implementation, I really kind of felt humbled in really not having a tool set or kit to really help them with the transformative change they're trying to affect, as well as how we assess it. And in this case, with the Scaleup Gap program, the business owner at the time, Terry Rakwalski, came, and I kind of said, I have tools in our toolbox. They're necessary, but I think they're insufficient. And as a result of that, and a result of working with many initiatives in this space, we came up with this process. We call it the house that impact built. And it was really based on experience working on large initiatives. So we always start with impact by design. So Alberta Innovates is a mission-driven organization, so being very clear on the targeted impact is very important. As we go through the house, aligning the impact purpose with the organizational strategy is important, and looking at scanning and the need, and having a learning management system, which this is, so in terms of implementation. People matter, and when we're working on these initiatives, we find that we need impact specialists to help us weave the data and the evidence across the life cycle. And with all of these types of initiatives, we are not able to do it without partnerships in the community across many different types. We call the missing floor really aligning our criteria and resources. What we often find is people desire impact, and when we go to look at the investment criteria and resources, impact isn't there as a criteria, so we ensure to align it. And then we work with roadmaps, and we also work with different types of instruments used in the organization. So this session is going to focus on the continuous assessment, and that's really part of the monitoring and the learning as we go. So in that, there's a key tool is our impact framework, how we measure as well as communicate. So I just wanted to let you know, we have this house. It's an adaptive learning system. We fit for purpose depending on the initiative. And on the left is really showing you in each of those kind of rooms, there's this toolbox, and we go in and we pick out tools as we need in terms of the initiative. What's interesting about today, when we hear from Jonathan, we took this realist approach that he's going to describe, but what it affected was how we actually report. So now, in terms of using this approach, collecting the evidence to generate real impact for our communities, we look at the insights found, what the issues are, and ideas for enhancement. And then the idea is that we hand that over as we're working with the program for them to implement and modify those enhancement or ideas. So in this continuous assessment, the other thing I wanted to highlight, because these are very much ecosystem initiatives, we use the idea of a splash and ripple that works really nice for research and innovation, so that as we're investing and working, there's a ripple effect in our community. The first layer are the outcomes that help us ultimately get to the pathway to impact, which for us is always economic, but can be focused on environment, on health, and social. And what's highlighted here is what Rhys is going to talk about, which really is the focus in terms of the Scale-Up Gap program. So using this metaphor of the splash and ripple affects how we think about measurement. What can we directly measure, and what is that spillover? What is that multiplier effect in our community? So now I'm going to hand over to Teresa, and she's going to give concrete, practical, realistic examples of the different floors of the house.
Thanks, Catherine. So my name is Risa John. I'm the Director of Fund and Fellowship at Alberta Innovates. So I'm going to provide an overview of how we applied PIMS, not to be confused with the beverage, that's later, to the scale-up and growth dilemma. And so PIMS really starts off with the end in mind, as Catherine highlighted, clearly identifying that North Star, what's the vision, the objectives, the targeted outcomes and impacts. So for Accelerators, that was us building a pathway to help them traverse that scale of death to scale and growth. We wanted to translate that into diversifying the economy, but really recognizing that in today's world, if we want to support epic or maximum scale and growth, we need to think beyond our local borders and also think about global pathways. So that was our North Star that we set out with. So then if we're following this house that Impact built, we start off with the roof. So the roof is all about scanning and planning and managing. And because we were trying to address a systemic gap in the ecosystem, we started off by conducting a very comprehensive environmental scan that took us over 2 years. So we looked at leading practices from around the world. We commissioned papers, we did pilots, and all of that helped us then inform the development of a scale-up gap strategy that was specific to Alberta. And so our strategy included 2 key pillars. One, the use of global accelerators under that PIMS model, but the other is this concept around fellowship, and I'll talk about that in a second. But another key aspect of us designing this strategy was something that we called play sets for growth. And it really was understanding that if we wanted to affect the ecosystem, we needed to have complementary play sets that helped companies go along that client journey. So the play sets were things like a mindset, fostering an entrepreneurial think big, think global state of mind, right? Getting our shy Alberta and Canadian companies to think be a little bit more bolder. A team set, really understanding that internally and externally we needed the right disciplines and talent to achieve that collective impact. The right tool set, right? So we needed to ensure that our companies had access to these relevant tools. And one of those tools was global accelerators, right? And then that impact set, right? We needed to design for impact right up front and carry that all the way through a monitoring and evaluation process so we could correct real time over the program life cycle. And then in the middle, right, is that fellowship piece, right? And so for us, that is focusing on collaboration and connection. We want to really foster that impact culture. And the hope was that if we institutionalize that philosophy of fellowship, right, we're going to generate not only network effects, but hopefully stickiness. Because even if these global accelerators don't stay in Alberta, the lasting effects of the capacity building that they're doing, right, will hopefully stay. So that's the roof of the house. Then we get to the second floor, and I have to push heavy, he said, okay. So the third floor is what we call people. And I know Catherine and I will argue about this, but I'm gonna say this is the most important floor because fundamental to the PIMS model is a focus on establishing an impact culture. And the only way that you can do that is through partnerships. So to me, it's really the secret sauce of amplifying impact. So it starts with a lot of principles. For us, it was the principles of co-development, the principles of abide, so advancing belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity to ensure that this program met all of the underrepresented group support across Alberta. So the concept of fellowship really is to set the conditions to strengthen the ecosystem to support that entrepreneurial growth. So it uses some key tactics, learning to accelerate getting to the next growth horizon, creating a culture of innovation and impact, building a connected and inclusive community, and fostering collaboration across ecosystem players. So using that fellowship, one of the key things about this model was we were able to form a funding consortium that included 3 levels of government, so at a municipal, provincial, and federal level. And I think that was also very key to having this program move forward. And I think there's some representatives of some of those 3 levels out here in the audience, so get a chance to talk to them later. So then the next layer of the house is our missing floor. And this is a floor that we often feel is left out. And it really is about embedding that impact all the way through, from aligning your investment to that impact, integrating it through all of your pathways. So for us, that started off with a very specific request for proposal to attract what we felt were the right fit accelerators to Alberta. And you can see a bit of the criteria that we used for that. And because we were not 100% certain based on the environmental scan which models would be the best fit for Alberta, we actually conducted this first phase of the program as a pilot. And so we have representation across many different models, from agnostic to specialized to industry partner models, to really do a deep dive, and Jonathan will talk about that in a sec, about which of those models were more relevant to Alberta. And then again, pulling that into the service delivery map, right? So not just grabbing some accelerators and plopping them down into the Alberta jurisdiction, but customizing them along our pathway, giving them swim lanes, right? And some parameters to operate within, and again, tying that into the whole fellowship component, so that companies had a whole pathway after they went through accelerators to then go further into an alumni network that continued the support for them. And so all of those things were embedded into all of the tools and the processes, right? Again, nothing was left to chance, right? It was all very intentional work to ensure that that would happen. And so in order to then, implement this process, what we found is we needed new roles. The traditional roles of contract manager or project manager just weren't sufficient enough anymore. So we actually created a triad model. And so that triad model includes an impact specialist. So that would be somebody like Catherine, right, who has that framework and that wealth of experience. Somebody like myself, who I'm going to coin a new term, the master implementer, who is more than just a project manager. They really have that whole sense of the entire ecosystem. And then the third is, I'm going to call it a content expert superstar. So somebody who not only understands the environment and the context, but has that passion and enthusiasm. And so if you want to talk to our content superstar, that's Lan Tan out in the audience, our director of Accelerators. So again, all of that was intentionally built into the process. And so then that bottom floor is about continuously assessing. So we formed working groups together with our co-funders and our accelerators to develop an impact framework and a measurement methodology. We used a life cycle approach to look at change over time. And so while it was a pretty intensive resource, you'll find out in a second with Jonathan that really paid off to help us understand what was going on and change correction over time. And then making sure that we communicated that back through annual scorecards and reports and impact stories. And then the very bottom or side of the house is that this is a continuous process. It doesn't just stop. So we constantly were using all of this information to continuously improve and adapt. So we had things like lessons learned huddles. So after every series of cohorts, we would get together with our accelerator partners and review that information and help us to course correct. We also felt it was important to share that information with the wider ecosystem. So we had a leading and learning forum after year 2. But the other really important way of us continuously adapting was building in advance a formative assessment at year 2. And so that's a perfect segue for me to turn this over to Jonathan to walk you through how we constructed that realist impact assessment.
Well, good morning. You've heard the theory, and I guess I was brought in to see whether it works, and that's what I want to talk about over the next 10 minutes or so. My name's Jonathan Grant. I run a small consultancy called Different Angles that focuses on the social impact of research, innovation, and universities. And indeed, I've been coming to Alberta on and off for over 20 years now. I was invited to a conference by the Alberta Fund for Medical Research. Is that the fund? The Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research, which in my sort of logic is like the great-great-grandparent of Alberta Innovates, but somebody can correct me on that. And that conference was called a bang for a buck. and it was about, we spend all this money on research, what happens? And obviously Alberta's Innovates mission has kind of moved from R&D into innovation funding, and as that's occurred, the instruments have changed. And one of these instruments is obviously the Scaleup and GAP program. So Catherine and Risa asked me to sort of come in and think about how you would assess this. And I did a project about 3 years ago over COVID, looking at one of the innovation networks in southern Alberta at the time. And we experimented with that and applied a realist approach in the jargon, and we thought that would be appropriate for the Accelerator program as well. The title of the report is a bit jargonistic, but quite important. We called it a formative realist impact assessment. Those last two words I think make sense. I hope they make sense. The first word is important. It's formative because the program is only 2 years old. We can't really tell you it works, it doesn't work. We can't be summative in the evaluation jargon. So it's very much a learning by doing approach, as Risa and Catherine have just explained. The term realist, it comes from evaluation methodology. And there's sort of two sort of dominant theories in evaluation methodology. That one is like the theory of change and logic modeling, which lots of you would be very comfortable with, and it follows an input process, outputs, outcomes, and impact. The realist approach is actually more focused on how those impacts occurs rather than what occurs, is what the theory of change is looking at. And the framework we use there is looking at this interaction between context and mechanism. So you have a very specific context here in Alberta. The accelerators, the 6 accelerators that were funded, bring in a range of different mechanisms, and that interaction between the context in Alberta and those mechanisms in the accelerators does something, and that something leads to some kind of outcome. And what we're really interested in is the breaking down what is happening in that black box. And that was the focus of this approach, because if we can understand what's happening in the black box, we can make the program more effective going forward and make course adjustments as needed. We adopted, inevitably, a mixed methods approach. We undertook 117 interviews and focus groups. About half of those were with entrepreneurs, and the rest were a mix of stakeholders, including Accelerator staff, investors, mentors, and the funders of the program. We looked at all the key documents. We undertook a sort of review of the sort of, in quotes, market for accelerators in Alberta. So I think there's a really interesting question about what's the supply and demand of accelerators. Is there a risk of oversupply of accelerators at times? I think that occurs in a number of contexts. We looked and undertook a leading practice review to see what lessons could be stolen from other countries if they are appropriate and could be contextualized. We tried to understand the network effects, but that wasn't very successful, I have to say, and we explored various models for understanding the economic impact of accelerators in the local context. Now, the report, and you have the cards on your table, and there's a QR code which allows you to download the report, but the report is split into the 3 chapters of context, mechanism, and outcomes. And as Catherine has alluded to, we start off with insights that have arisen from that data, and then identify a set of issues and ideas for taking those forward. Because of limited time, I'm going to only focus on a number of different of the insights, and in doing so, try to select, if you like, different methodological approaches. So the first one I wanted to talk about was the idea of closing the scale-up gap. The rationale that you've heard from Risa was, in our view, when we did the evaluation, based on sound logic and data. And what you can do is you can have an attempt, if you like, to try to measure the size of the scale-up gap. And this is based on the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. There are methodological issues with that. I'm not going to get into those at this stage, but anybody wants to discuss those, we can. But what we see in Alberta on the left-hand side is at the top, we see the number of established businesses, and bottom, we see the number of startup businesses. And what you would anticipate is that that gap would close as you enter into an intervention to try to close the scale up. What's interesting is when you compare that to other countries, we actually find Alberta is doing quite well. Which, as an outsider coming in, I think is an important lesson. So yes, you have a problem. It'd be great to, be even better, but actually you're starting off in a reasonably good place. You have a lot of entrepreneurial activity, startup activity, and reasonably high levels of scale up. Through that, you're doing better than Canada. Your scale-up gap is smaller than in Canada as a whole, and you've got more startup activity than Canada as a whole. As you can see, there are a couple of outliers here, and that's Chile and the US. And then on the right-hand side, you have where you almost have a negative scale-up gap, conceptually. So the one on the far right is South Korea. So South Korea is not very good at entrepreneurial activity, but has a lot of established businesses. So a very interesting, different problem. So the first lesson here is actually you're starting from a good place as a province. The second issue we picked up was around the fact that enterprises and entrepreneurs were quite early in their entrepreneurial journey. And as you will well know, there are lots of different models for accelerators. And the model adopted here in Alberta is one which is funded through public money. And what we found was that the selection rates for the pre-accelerators was around 50%, and for the 4 accelerators was roughly 1 in 5. That is quite a high selection rate when you compare it to commercial type models, which are typically around less than 5%, so are more competitive. Our interpretation of that, especially reinforced through the interviews, is that's because of the somewhat young nature of many startup enterprises in Alberta. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it means accelerators can be really, really helpful, but what it means is those accelerators need to adapt their provision to take into account that level of maturity in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. If we move on to the mechanisms, I want to focus on the fellowship one as Risa's highlighted that. And what we observed was that the team had done a great job in starting up the accelerators. A really complex job. It was a big procurement, 35 million Canadian dollars invested in the program. Just getting that program up and running takes time, it takes effort, lots of problem solving. The accelerators are now functioning very well, as we'll come back to. But to a degree, we observed that the fellowship had been lost in that startup phase for the accelerator program, and more focus should be put on the fellowship now the accelerators are established. And we identified in the international review a number of examples of fellowships, a number of examples where Alberta Innovates could learn some lessons. And what we observed was that in interviews was that the entrepreneurs who were engaged in the fellowship found it very, very helpful, but lots of them did not know that they were part of the fellowship, so there's a branding issue, if you like. And secondly, lots of them were not engaged, and we heard lots of comments, what happens next? So somebody's gone through the accelerator program, and they want to know what happens next. And in theory, the fellowship program should be stepping into that space, but that's yet to happen at scale. And the 2 examples we liked were from South Korea on the left, which is the Global Digital International Network, which is a very interesting model where the intervention is very long-term and actually is embedded within the companies, so people get seconded into the companies to help them develop their skill sets in going forward and expanding their international client base. And that embeddedness can be for longer than a year, so an interesting model. And the other model we liked from the International Review was the Pipeline Accelerator from Kansas, which very much picked up on this idea of fellowship post-accelerator intervention and had a real focus on systems and systems reform. So sort of one of the ideas we've suggested to Alberta Innovates is they look to learn the lessons from that. So to move on to the outcomes, the one I want to focus on is this idea of entrepreneurial capital. I'm going to come back to that and just acknowledge the overall conclusion because senior leaders want a one-sentence answer. And this is the one-sentence answer. The Scale-Up and Growth Accelerator program is contributing to the impact and evolution of a strengthened and vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem in Alberta. So tick, it's working, continue with it with reform. We can look at the data around that, and this is the 2-year Scaleup scorecard. You probably can't read it at the back, but we have that $35 million investment from Alberta Innovates and its partners that supported these 2 pre-accelerators and 6 accelerators. 574 companies have now gone through the program. 2,500 applied for it. As I said, there's a 1 in 5 success rate, so that's working at scale. And when we get down to the economic impact, the companies report that they've generated 249 jobs and $22 million of Canadian dollars of revenues. But probably most impressive is the KPI around return on investment. Basically, for every dollar invested by Alberta Innovates and its partners, there's been $8 coming from third-party investors into the enterprises going into accelerators. On the right, we have those system impacts that Catherine was very much talking about. 150 mentors have been trained as part of the program. That training will stay within the province for a long time and contributes to the human capital. Overall, the data from the PIMS system tells us around 1,300 people have engaged some way or another with the program. So again, you're creating social capital and networks. So lots of numbers there, but broadly speaking, again, a big tick. But getting back to this idea of what's the black box, we spent a lot of time trying to think through how is this occurring. So we understand the context, we understand the mechanisms of the accelerators and their programs, we can see these outcomes, but what is the magic, if you like, between all of that occurring? And we adopted this idea, of which there is an academic literature, around entrepreneurial capital. So thinking about the role of accelerators is actually generating entrepreneurial capital, and we define that in 4 ways. There's financial capital, so you saw those investments statistics, that's going into the system. And I think we spend a lot of time focusing on those indicators, and we do so whilst missing the other 3 capitals. So we have human capital, so everybody who's gone through an accelerator has been trained. Their personal human capital has improved, and hence the human capital within the province has improved. But it's not just the people participating in the accelerators, it's those mentors. It's the accelerator staff who have improved their practice and learned through the process. So you're building that human capital in the ecosystem. The social capital gets at the connections, if you like, the networking effects that occur. Now, as I said, we tried to measure that, but weren't very successful because we didn't have the data to do that. But qualitatively, it was absolutely clear that there was evidence that network effects were developing and had been sort of deepened as a result. But the cultural capital is one I find really interesting. Again, being as an outsider, the idea that Alberta Innovates and its partners are willing to invest $35 million into a program of which most of it is spent on bringing global accelerators into Alberta is a very interesting concept. But what that does is it sends signals, and that's the cultural capital. It sends signals to those global accelerators who applied that Alberta is an interesting place for innovation. It sends signals to the entrepreneurs here in Alberta that we care about you. We're going to get the best accelerators globally to come and support you on your entrepreneurial journey. And it sends a broader sort of signal to the investment community and to mentors that Alberta is a hub where innovation occurs. So very hard to measure that, but there's a real intangible thing around cultural capital. So to move on, to wrap up basically, I'm not going to go through these, but these are the 8 issues that we identified and sort of have booked back to Risa and her team to think about as they look to take the program into the sort of next phase over the next few years. And for each of these ideas, and they're spelled out in the report, there are a number of different, each of these issues, there are a number of different ideas that we suggest that could be considered and evaluated for implementation. So just my sort of takeaways, my last slide. sort of reflecting on this at a more personal level, if you like, I do think this issue of context really, really matters. And I think we overlook that. And I think there was a risk, actually, and we talk about this in the report, that when the global accelerators came in, they applied effectively a cookie-cutter model. They learned quite quickly, Alberta Innovates learned quite quickly that wasn't working, and adaptations were made. But understanding context seems absolutely critical. Taking this ecosystem approach, again, I think is really all credit to Alberta Innovates. It's got a number of interventions which are in the ecosystem. I think the challenge is making sure they're joined up. So again, we found evidence in the evaluation that the innovation networks were not really well connected to the accelerators and vice versa. If you could get those joined well, that can make a very meaningful difference. And then this idea and framing around entrepreneurial capital, I think allows you to move away from the sole framing of financial KPIs to a broader framing which captures those human, social, and cultural capitals. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Catherine.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And just on reflection for us as we think through the findings in terms of implementation and measurement now is really elucidating what in those capitals can we consider to measure as kind of this holistic impact and value to our local jurisdictions and communities. So we're very interested in thinking about the tangibles and the intangibles. But we have 5 minutes for questions. I think we have people, if you just raised your hand, with mics, and really encourage questions to Risa and Jonathan here. And just raise your hand high, and that would be great.
Yeah, this isn't really a question. My name is Alan Knight. My company is Step Change Capital. We provide scale-up capital to businesses. So I thought, I didn't see that being explained. So businesses that have a proven commercial product, that have customers and revenues, and now want to scale from there, that's where scale-up capital comes in. So they have to have customers, revenues, they want to scale to create a defensible, sustainable position. Anyway, that's my view of that scale-up niche sort of thing.
Thank you. Risa, any comment?
Yeah, and so essentially for those companies, right, this is an offering for them to assist them with that scale and growth, right? So any Alberta company can apply to one of our accelerators, and as well it's open to global companies because we want to see that network and those connections. So this was really meant to be a solution to try and address and accelerate those opportunities for companies.
Thank you. Any other questions? Just put up your hand. I have one here.
I'm interested how particularly the cultural capital moved compared with other geographies. There's a particular geography about, well, probably the province of Alberta, and I just wonder if there are any lessons you learned compared with your other work.
Jonathan.
It's a very good question, David. I think the idea of, I think cultural capital can manifest itself in many, many different ways. So I identified, if you like, the signaling effect of the program, and I think that's a form of cultural capital, but an important form. So if a government says we are going to do X, whether they manage to implement it or not, is sending messages. But if I say Silicon Valley, yeah, you've all got perceptions of what Silicon Valley looks like, operates like. That is cultural capital. Yeah, that's got a brand, a reputation, a set of intangibles which may or may not be backed up by the other three capitals. So I think it is very, very context specific, and hence that's one of my key takeaways is context matters.
Thanks, Jonathan. A question here. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Very important to Alberta, of course, is the Indigenous context, but that's also very important to my country, New Zealand, and also to the other country represented here, quite broadly, Australia. Do you have any experience with that particular issue? Because what we see is as we engage in these types of discussions with the Indigenous communities, their way of seeing the world is somewhat different, perhaps, than the mainstream. How does this handle that?
Great, Risa.
Yeah, so when we started off, we had a set of guiding principles, and one was certainly around abide. And when we think about, Alberta, we have certain underrepresented groups. One is our Indigenous population, but in addition to that, there's also the compounding of remote and rural, right? So it was embedded into the RFP. It was one of the weighted criteria to see how accelerators had existing, pathways to address that. We spent a lot of time linking our accelerators up with underrepresented group organizations. But I would say that was one area, and we comment on that in the report, that we did not get anywhere near where we wanted to be, right? So that will be one of the areas that we'll need to delve in deeper and look at some of the leading practice examples, from around the world to help us really address that issue. Me personally, it was one of the disappointments that we didn't get further, because I feel that it's just like casting a net. If you don't include your entire community, you're not going to be as strong in your impact and in your fellowship. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to add about some of the leading practice examples.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and it was interesting in interviews we did, and we did a lot. It never came up as a topic until we prompted it. Yeah, so Alberta Innovates had asked accelerators to develop EDI plans. It was central to the procurement process. But as Risa said, from an evaluation point of view, I don't think it succeeded as much as the plans had anticipated. And I think there is a good question as why that's the case. And we don't have the answer to that, but yeah.
Yeah, and to highlight, we do have a leading practices report, and as part of that, we wanted to learn from other jurisdictions who've practically integrated equity, diversity, inclusion, also Indigenous-led approaches, and how to understand that ways of knowing for impact, how that's going to change things. So we hope to have that report released in June.
June 17th.
Yeah, so there are some really excellent examples and practices across the world that we want to pursue ourselves as part of that bigger concept of impact. Okay, so just going to wrap up. So in terms of next steps, as you can hear, we're on a journey. We're on a journey to understand how and why the interventions, mechanisms we do generate a change for our communities and jurisdictions. We want to keep advancing our thinking and looking at the evidence and collaborate with others around the world. In speaking to our social innovation colleagues, they talk about impact zones. So I was imagining we have geographical impact zones across the world who are trying to do something similar, and in their context, hear what they're doing, hear about their practices, what works and doesn't work, and then testing and experimenting like we are here to find what is the evidence, and coming together across all those impact zones in our little sandboxes to find out things that are common across and things that are unique to our context, and having this kind of shared toolbox in how can we better accelerate impact for our communities. Because when we generate real impact, it is easier to demonstrate it and communicate it. So just imagine these impact zones, testing, advancing this type of work. So here is for you to download the full realist impact approach report. You have the handy dandy cards, and then wait for the leading, and we started calling them interesting practices around the world as part of the philosophy of learning and sharing. And we would welcome to hear from you on your journey, and we're welcome to share that as well. So thank you for your attention, and really appreciate your questions, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
And I just wanted an opportunity, because we do have some of our funding and accelerator partners in the audience. This journey started about 3 years ago with a leap of faith. Thank you for coming on the journey with us.